Have you ever stood at a crossroads where a single choice could change the rest of your life? In the shadow of Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, in 1875, a man named Jake Murdoch found himself facing a sight he'd never forget. A young Comanche woman bound to the cold steel of the railroad tracks, the whistle of an oncoming train echoing through the canyon. Her words were not a plea, but a quiet bargain. "Please, cut me loose before the train comes. I'll be your wife. I'll do whatever you ask." Imagine it, 3 armed men nearby, the heat of the sun pressing down, and the seconds slipping away. Would you risk your life to save hers, or turn away, knowing trouble would follow you home? This is not just a story of rescue. It's about trust earned through hardship, about finding a reason to stay when the world has given you every reason to leave. If this story touches something in you, please like this video and subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. And share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done now? Let's begin our journey into the heart of the Wild West. The sun was slipping low behind the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, pouring a copper light across the valley. The air carried that crisp edge it always did at the tail end of summer, when the days were still warm, but the nights hinted at frost. Jake Murdoch guided his horse down a narrow cut in the trail, the creak of the saddle mixing with the steady clop of hooves on packed dirt. He had been riding for hours, letting the quiet do its work. Out here, far from Powder Creek town, the only sound was the wind pushing through the pines and the occasional cry of a hawk. But now there was something else, something unnatural. It came first as a faint hum, like a hive of bees miles away. Then it grew, the tone deepening until he knew exactly what it was, the iron heartbeat of a locomotive working its way up the grade. Along with it came another scent, sharp and sour hot metal carried on the wind. Jake eased his gelding around the bend, eyes narrowing. The cut in the earth dropped toward the rail line 100 yards below, the steel flashing in the late light. That's when he saw her. A figure lay stretched across the rails, arms and legs bound tight with coarse rope. Her dark hair whipped about her face in the wind, but her gaze, steady and unblinking, was locked on the horizon. She wasn't screaming, wasn't thrashing, just watching. Behind her, in the distance, a black plume of smoke rose, the train's outline already visible against the pale sky. Jake's grip tightened on the reins. He clicked his tongue, nudging the horse forward for a better look. As the gap closed, the details sharpened, deerskin dress torn at the hem, skin streaked with dust, raw marks at the wrists where she'd fought the ropes. And then her eyes found his. Her voice came clear over the rumble in the rails. "Please, cut me loose before the train comes. I'll be your wife. I'll do whatever you ask." It wasn't a scream. There was no pleading edge. It was measured, deliberate, more bargain than desperation. Jake pulled his horse to a halt halfway down the slope, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. He'd seen a lot in 45 years, most of it in the roughest corners of the West. Men tied to stakes for debts they couldn't pay, families run off their land by greed and lead, women taken because nobody was around to stop it. But this was something else. 3 men stood off to the side of the tracks, half in shadow from the low sun. Their coats were heavy wool, boots caked in red dust, and from the way they swayed, Jake guessed they were deep in a bottle. One idly tossed stones toward the woman, laughing when she flinched. The train whistle blew one long, warning note that echoed off the canyon walls. It was close now. Too close. Jake measured the distance with an instinct born from years chasing fugitives, less than a minute before the engine would be on top of her. His mind split in two. One part told him to ride on, keep his head down, let trouble belong to someone else. That had been his way for years now. Stay out of fights that weren't his. The other part, The part he thought had died along with his wife and son was already pushing his boots toward the ground. The gelding tossed its head as Jake swung down. He left the reins loose so the horse could move if gunfire started. His boots crunched over dry grass as he took a step toward the scene, eyes locked on the three men. One of them noticed. His laughter died. Jake stopped just far enough that his voice could carry, "Step away from her." The tallest shifted his weight, squinting into the glare. "Ain't your business, friend." Jake's hand hovered near the worn leather of his holster, not touching it, but close enough to speak its own language. "You make her my business when you put her on those rails." The second man spat in the dirt. The first took a half step forward. Jake held his ground, eyes steady, jaw tight. The sound of the train filled the air now, iron grinding against iron. He didn't raise his voice again. Instead, he moved slow, deliberate toward the woman. None of the men stepped closer. Whether it was the set of his shoulders or the years of something darker in his eyes, they didn't test him. The ropes were rough, heat-dried, and stiff. Jake pulled the knife from his belt and cut fast. One stroke for the ankles, two for the wrists. The moment she was free, she rolled clear of the track, gravel biting into her skin. Jake caught her by the arm, pulling her toward the shallow ditch at the side. The rails began to shake under their boots. "Move," he said quietly. They dropped into the dry weeds just as the locomotive roared past, the ground trembling under the weight. Hot wind slammed into them, bringing the tang of coal smoke and oil. When the last car rattled by, the valley fell silent again. Jake let go of her arm, scanning the three men. They stood where they had before, watching. He could feel the tension like a rope stretched between them. The woman straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. She met his eyes once more, the earlier bargain still unspoken between them, but hanging in the air all the same. Jake knew one thing for certain, whatever this was, it wasn't over. The three men lingered near the edge of the track, their boots planted wide, shoulders slack with the easy carelessness of men deep into whiskey. The bottle rested on the ground between them, its neck catching the last of the daylight. One of them, a stocky man with a jaw like a fence post, stooped, scooped up a stone, and lobbed it toward the bound woman. The rock skittered against the rail, landing inches from her ribs. She flinched, not from pain but from the insult, and kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. That was enough to make the men laugh, a coarse, hollow sound that floated up toward the ridge where Jake stood. He felt his jaw tighten. Jake nudged his gelding forward, the horse picking its way down the slope toward the rails. The air grew hotter with every step, the metallic scent of the oncoming train sharpening. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud when he swung down from the saddle. The gelding stayed behind him, reins slack, as if it knew not to wander far. The three men turned when he was close enough for his voice to carry. He kept it low, steady, letting the weight settle in each word. "Step away from her." The tallest of the three, a wiry man with a sunburned neck, snorted. "You lost, friend." "No," Jake said, his gaze holding steady on them. "But you're about to be if you don't move." They weren't used to being spoken to that way. That much was clear. For a moment, they studied him, the worn duster, the dust-caked boots, the holster hanging low at his hip. A man who'd seen trouble and hadn't flinched from it. The stocky one tilted his head, as if weighing his odds. The train whistle blew again, louder now, a shrill cry that made the rails hum underfoot. The sound filled the air, a reminder that time was running out. One of them took half a step forward, then stopped. Jake hadn't moved his hand, but the set of his shoulders told its own story. The men shifted uneasily. With the engine's shadow beginning to grow on the horizon, Jake closed the distance to the woman, the coarse ropes cut deep into her skin, the fibers stiff with dust and heat. He drew his knife and made quick work of them, 2 strokes at her wrists, 1 at her ankles. She was lighter than he expected when he hauled her up, but steady on her feet. No sooner had she cleared the track than the ground began to tremble in earnest. "Move!" he said, and his hand found her arm, steering her toward the shallow ditch that lined the rails. They scrambled down just as the locomotive thundered past, a black wall of steel and iron filling their vision. The air punched at them, hot and heavy, with the smell of coal smoke. The wheels screamed against the rails, sending a shiver through the earth beneath them. Jake crouched low until the last car rattled by, leaving only a storm of dust in its wake. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the rasp of their breathing. He straightened first, scanning the three men. They hadn't moved far, still standing, still watching. Something in their posture had changed, though. They no longer looked like men in control of the situation. Beside him, the woman pushed the hair from her face. Her eyes met his, calm but unreadable, and then flicked back to the men on the other side of the track. Jake kept his voice low. "You all right?" She gave the barest nod, but said nothing. The men didn't speak either. One spat into the dirt. Another picked up the whiskey bottle and tipped it back. The third turned his gaze toward the direction the train had gone, as if deciding there was no more entertainment to be had here. Jake didn't wait for them to find their courage again. He stepped up the slope toward his horse, guiding the woman with him. She didn't resist, didn't ask questions. At the top, he swung into the saddle and offered her a hand. She hesitated for half a heartbeat, then let him pull her up in front of him. The gelding shifted under their combined weight, then settled into a steady lope. They rode away from the tracks, the wind carrying with it the fading scent of smoke. The sun was nearly gone now, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley. Jake kept his eyes ahead, but his mind was still on the three figures behind them, and the certainty that this wasn't the last time he'd see them. The woman sat rigid in the saddle, her hands resting lightly on the horn. She didn't look back once. And Jake, though every instinct told him to leave this alone, already knew he wouldn't. The trail away from the tracks wound through a stand of spruce, their shadows long and sharp in the fading light. The gelding's hooves thudded against the packed earth, the sound muffled under a blanket of evening air. Jake kept the pace steady, neither rushing nor lingering, feeling the woman's weight shift slightly with the rhythm of the ride. She hadn't spoken since they left. Her back was straight, hands resting lightly on the horn, eyes fixed ahead. If she was frightened, she didn't show it, not in her breathing, not in her posture. An hour later, the trees thinned and the slope leveled. Nestled against a ridge of dark stone stood a weathered hunting lodge, little more than a cabin with a pitched roof and a lean-to shed. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, the scent of it mixing with the cool mountain air. Jake dismounted first, boots crunching on the gravel. He offered his hand, and she slid down without a word. The ground was cold beneath their feet, the last warmth of the day fading fast. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of old wood smoke and pine resin. The cabin was simple, one room, a stove with a black iron belly, a scarred wooden table, and two mismatched chairs. Against one wall, racks of tanned hides hung beside a pegboard of tools. A single oil lamp on the table threw a warm, flickering light that softened the hard edges of the place. Jake set his hat on a peg and crossed to the stove, opening its small door. A bed of embers glowed inside. He added a couple of split logs, then turned to a wooden chest near the bed. From it, he pulled a pair of worn leather moccasins and set them on the floor in front of her. "They're old, but they'll keep the cold off," he said. She hesitated, glancing from him to the shoes, then stepped forward and slipped them on. The fit was loose, but she didn't complain. From a shelf near the stove, Jake took a dented tin pot, filled it with water from a jug, and set it on the heat. Steam began to rise, carrying the clean scent of the mountain spring. He poured 2 cups, pushing one across the table toward her. She wrapped her hands around it without lifting it to her lips, as if testing the warmth before deciding. From a cloth sack, Jake pulled a strip of dried venison, tore it in 2, and set half on a plate for her. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it'll sit in your stomach." She nodded once, taking the meat without looking away from him. Jake sat across from her, the lamplight catching the lines in his face. It had been years since he'd shared this table with anyone. The last time. It was his wife sliding a plate toward their boy, her laughter folding into the crackle of the fire. The memory came unbidden, sharp enough to make him glance away. They ate in silence. Outside. The wind shifted, brushing against the cabin walls with a low sigh. Every so often, she glanced toward the window, her gaze quick and searching, like a deer listening for the snap of a twig. "You'll be safe here tonight," Jake said finally. Her eyes lingered on his for a moment before she looked back to the window. She didn't answer, but he didn't press her. Trust was a slow thing to build, especially for someone who'd been left tied to steel with death bearing down. When the plates were cleared, Jake added more wood to the stove, the flames catching with a soft roar. The warmth filled the small room, mingling with the faint, sweet smell of the lamp oil. He gestured toward the bed in the corner. "You take that. I'll sleep by the fire." She stayed where she was, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dark beyond the glass. It was as if she was measuring the thickness of the walls, the strength of the door, and the distance to whatever might be out there. Jake didn't take it personally. He'd seen the same look in his own reflection once, when the only safe place was the one you hadn't found yet. The beans on the stove had been simmering for the better part of an hour, their scent mixing with the faint tang of venison and the sweeter note of onion. Jake ladled the stew into 2 tin bowls, the metal ringing softly in the quiet cabin. He set one in front of her and eased into the opposite chair, the lamplight casting a warm, gold wash over the rough table. For a while, they ate in silence. Outside, the wind brushed against the eaves, and somewhere beyond the dark glass, a night bird called once, then fell quiet. The fire in the stove popped, sending tiny sparks up the iron throat. Jake had learned long ago that some stories wouldn't come if you pushed for them. So he waited, letting the warmth of the meal and the steady comfort of the room do their work. When he finally spoke, his tone was light, but his eyes held steady on hers. "You were headed somewhere before they found you." Her spoon paused in midair. She didn't look up, just let the question hang between them. After a moment, she nodded once and set the spoon down. "North," she said. Her voice was low, steady, as if she were speaking to the fire instead of to him. "To meet what's left of my mother's people. They were camped along the Powder River. I was a day behind them." Jake nodded slowly, giving her room to go on. "They came at night," she said. 3 at first, then more. Said they'd trade me for rifles and whiskey in another camp. I thought, maybe they would. Maybe it was just for bargaining." Her eyes drifted to the side, away from his. "But they kept me. Tied when they were drunk, tied when they were sober. Didn't matter. I learned not to ask why." Jake's gaze dropped to her wrists. In the lamplight, the marks stood out thin bands of skin rubbed raw once, healed over in darker ridges. They weren't from that afternoon alone. These were older, layered from days or weeks of rope. "They called me half-blood," she added after a moment. "Said my father made me bad luck. Said no one would come looking." Her voice didn't break, but there was a flatness to it, the kind a person wore when they'd told themselves the same thing too many times to count. Jake leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He knew that weight, the sense that you didn't belong anywhere, that the road only ever led you back to the same empty place. The night he'd lost his wife and boy, the world had closed in until it was just him and the hollow sound of his own breathing. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. And he meant it, though he knew the words were just drops in a dry well. Her gaze flicked to him for the briefest moment, searching his face for something, maybe proof he understood, maybe just a place to set the thought down. Then she looked back at the fire. They ate in silence again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was heavier, filled with unspoken things. The stove's heat pressed into the room, softening the edges of the night. When they finished, Jake took the bowls to the basin. The water from the jug was cold, biting at his fingers as he rinsed them. He could feel her eyes on his back, not in suspicion, but in that watchful way of someone who'd learned to take measure of people when their guard was down. He dried his hands on a rag and turned to find her still at the table, her hands folded loosely now. The lamplight made her look younger, but her eyes carried the years back again. For a long stretch, they just sat in the shared glow of the fire. Every so often, the wind nudged the window pane, and the loose shutter outside gave a lazy knock. Jake made a mental note to fix it, come morning. "You'll be safe here tonight," he said finally. She didn't answer, but her eyes followed the flames as they climbed, her expression unreadable. It wasn't mistrust exactly, but something like a worn habit measuring every promise against the world that had kept none for her so far. Jake didn't push. Trust was something built a nail at a time, and he'd only just handed her the hammer. The wind shifted, bringing a faint smell of snow down from the higher peaks. Jake stood, crossed to the stove, and added another log. The fire caught, crackling softly. Behind him, she rose from the table at last and crossed to the bed in the corner. She sat on the edge, moccasin tips just touching the floor, her gaze drawn once more to the window. Outside, the night lay deep and dark. Inside, the only sound was the slow breath of the fire and the quiet weight of two people who knew too well what it meant to lose everything. The mountains held their breath for 2 days. The wind stayed soft, the trails stayed empty, and the cabin felt almost like it belonged to another life, one where trouble didn't ride so easily on a man's shadow. But on the third morning, just as the sun began tilting toward its long drop west, the quiet broke. Jake was on the porch, mending the rawhide on a saddle stirrup, when the sound reached him, distant at first, just a faint drumming that could have been the wind playing tricks. Then it grew heavier, more measured. Hoofbeats, several of them. He set the saddle aside and stood, scanning the tree line. They appeared in a staggered line along the far edge of the clearing, 5 riders, moving with that loose sway of men who'd spent too many days in the saddle and too many nights with a bottle. 3 of them he recognized instantly, the faces from the tracks, burned into his memory with the sound of a train screaming past. The other 2 were new hard-eyed, their rifles slung easy across their backs. The group fanned out slightly as they approached, the horses' breath puffing in the cool air. Dust curled off their boots as they reined in just short of the split-rail fence. One of the men from before, broad-shouldered, with a sunburned neck, leaned forward in his saddle. His voice carried, rough and certain. "She's ours. Murdoch. Hand her over." Jake didn't move from the top step. His right hand rested lightly near the worn leather of his holster, close enough to speak its own warning. But he didn't draw. "You put a woman on the rails," he said evenly. "You lost your claim." The man's mouth twisted. "That's not how it works. It is here." A murmur ran through the group. One of the newcomers shifted in his saddle, scanning the cabin door. Behind that door, the air was still. Jake could almost feel her on the other side, listening. Then, without warning, the latch clicked. The door opened. Nayeli stepped out onto the porch, the worn moccasins whispering against the wood. Her hair caught the low sunlight. Her chin lifted. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice clear in the open air. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Even the horses seemed to hold still. The tall, narrow-faced man in the group let out a low laugh. "You'll change your mind when the law comes for you." Jake's tone cut clean through the space between them. "The law's a long ride from here. Until it gets here, you're looking at it." The leader's eyes slid from Jake to Nayeli and back again, weighing something in the space of a breath. Finally, he shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking. "You'll regret this," he said, but the words didn't carry much weight now. With a jerk of his chin, he turned his horse. The others followed, though not all with the same ease. One of the newcomers looked back twice before they disappeared into the trees, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. Jake stayed where he was until the sound was gone. Then he glanced at Nayeli. She hadn't moved, her hands resting at her sides, her eyes steady. "They'll be back," he said quietly. Her gaze didn't waver. "Then we'll be ready." It wasn't defiance in her tone, more like a simple fact. Stated and accepted. Jake gave a short nod. "All right." The light was slipping fast, shadows pooling at the base of the trees. Jake stepped off the porch, checking the fence line before heading for the shed. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar shavings. He lifted a coil of rope, a box of nails, and an old canvas tarp, already making a mental list of what would need fixing before nightfall. When he stepped back outside, Nayeli was still on the porch, but her eyes were on the tree line now, not the ground. She didn't flinch when he met her gaze. Whatever had been bound up in her since the tracks was loosening, replaced by something steadier. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant rain, Jake knew they had moved from strangers sharing a roof to something harder, to shake two people standing in the same circle, against the same horizon. The next morning dawned pale and cold, the kind of light that made the mountains look sharper, closer. Jake stepped out onto the porch with his coffee in hand, scanning the tree line the way a man checks the horizon for weather. No movement, no sound but the wind running its fingers through the pines. "They'll try again," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. From inside the doorway, Nayeli's voice answered, "Steady, then we should be ready." They spent the day making that readiness into something real. The first job was the door. Jake pulled the hinges, reset the screws deeper into the frame, and added an extra bar across the inside. Nayeli held the wood in place while he drove each nail, her grip firm and sure. From there, they turned to the windows. A couple of old shutters hung loose, their boards warped from seasons of sun and snow. Together they pried them off, replaced the hinges, and set the latch hooks so they'd drop fast if needed. By midday, the sun had warmed the clearing enough that the snowmelt ran in small rivulets down toward the creek. They dug shallow trenches on either side of the yard, filling them with broken brush and stones, a trip hazard for horses coming in too fast. Jake showed her how to set a couple of simple snares along the back trail, not meant to catch men, but to give warning if anyone tried circling around. She worked without complaint, her moccasins whispering over the pine needles, her hands quick on knots and rope. Now and then, Jake caught her glancing toward the ridge, measuring distances in her head the same way he did, late in the afternoon. They went out to check the last of the warning traps, a small loop set along a deer path that ran parallel to the clearing. The path curved along a slope of loose stone, the kind that shifted under your weight if you didn't watch your step. Jake crouched to test the trigger on the snare. It needed a small adjustment, so he leaned in, his boots set wide for balance. The rope slipped easily through his fingers as he reset it, but when he stood and turned, his left foot found a patch of gravel hiding under dry leaves. It happened too fast to stop. His boots slid, the stones rolled, and the next thing he knew, the world tilted hard. His shoulder struck a jut of rock before the rest of him hit the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and a white-hot streak of pain tore through his right side. Jake. Her voice was sharp, close. He blinked, finding her already scrambling down the slope toward him. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, her hands bracing on either side of him. "Don't move," she said, her eyes scanning his shoulder. He tried anyway, and the pain made him suck in a breath through his teeth. He stopped. Admitting it out loud would make it real. "Your arm," she said, "looks like the joint's out." He wanted to argue, but she was already shifting to get under his good side. "Come on, we'll get you back to the lodge." The walk was slow, uneven. Every step jarred his shoulder, sending sparks of heat down into his chest. She took most of his weight without hesitation, her small frame moving steady as a pack mule. Inside, she steered him to the table, cleared it with one sweep of her arm, and pressed him down into the chair. "Hold still." From the peg by the stove, she pulled a strip of cloth and old work shirt Jake had meant to cut up for patches. She tore it clean down the seam with quick, sure motions. "This will hurt," she said, meeting his eyes just long enough to make sure he understood. He nodded once. She set herself at his side, braced his arm against her hip, and with a firm, practiced movement, rolled the joint back into place. The dull pop made his stomach lurch, but the pain eased almost at once, replaced by a deep, aching throb. When it was done, she tied the cloth into a sling, adjusting the knot behind his neck. "You don't lift anything for a while," she said. Jake managed a dry smile. "You sound like you've done this before." "Twice," she said simply. "My uncle." He leaned back, the heat from the stove wrapping around him. "Guess I'm lucky you were here." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved to the stove, ladled water into a cup, and set it in front of him. Only then did she say, "You're the only one here. If something happens to you, I'm alone again." The words settled between them, heavier than the logs in the stove. Jake looked at her for a long moment, feeling the truth of it press into his ribs harder than the fall had. It had been years since he'd trusted anyone to watch his back. Now, here she was, doing it without asking, without making it a bargain. That night, he didn't bother unrolling his bedroll by the fire. He stayed in the chair near the stove, the rifle within reach, watching the lamplight flicker across the room. Across from him, Nayeli sat on the edge of the bed, mending a tear in her dress, the quiet scratch of needle and thread the only sound over the wind outside. For the first time in a long while, Jake realized that keeping this place safe wasn't just about him anymore. By the next morning, the rhythm of the place had changed. Jake woke to the sound of boots light, quick steps across the porch before the door creaked open and the smell of wood smoke rolled in. Nayeli was already outside, scattering feed for the mule, her breath making small clouds in the cool air. Through the frost-fogged window, he watched her move from the pen to the stacked firewood, her arms full before she even bothered to pull her shawl tighter. There was no pause, no glance toward the ridge. She worked like she'd been here all her life, like the place belonged to her just as much as to him. When he stepped out, the cold cut straight through his shirt. She was crouched by the kindling box, coaxing a flame to life in the outdoor pit. "You could have waited," he said, settling himself against the porch rail. She didn't look up. Fire doesn't wait for you to be ready. Neither do animals. He had no answer for that. Instead, he limped down the steps, still careful with his bad shoulder, and took a seat on the chopping block. She fed the fire, straightened, and looked at him just long enough for the corners of her mouth to twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Over the next few days, Jake noticed how easily she'd taken on the work. She mucked the pen without complaint, fetched water from the creek, and stacked the woodpile higher than it had been in months. When night came, she insisted on taking the first watch, her eyes scanning the tree line while Jake slept for a few hours. The second evening, as he rolled his bedroll out by the stove, he said, "You don't have to do all this." Her voice came from the shadows near the window. "You can't. Not right now. Somebody has to." It wasn't said with pride or with a jab at his injury, just fact. And somehow that made it land deeper. On the third night, when the wind was so strong it rattled the shutters, they both stayed awake. The fire crackled, throwing warm light against the log walls. Jake sat at the table, turning his coffee cup between his hands, while Nayeli sat on the edge of the bed, her knees drawn up under her shawl. Without looking at him, she said, "I don't remember the last time I slept through a whole night." He let the quiet stretch a moment before answering. "Same here. Years, probably." She glanced at him then, her eyes steady. "What keeps you up?" He thought about giving the easy answer, old habits, a bad shoulder, the weather, but instead he said, "Noise that isn't there. My wife and boy, they were gone before I heard the shots." Her gaze dropped to her hands, fingers working at a loose thread on the shawl. "When they took me, it was midday. Sun was bright. My mother used to say danger comes in the dark. She was wrong. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The only sound was the wind trying the latch on the door. By the fourth morning, there was something different in the air, not comfort, not yet, but a kind of understanding. They spoke more, not in long stories, but in fragments. A memory about a horse Jake once had, a story from Nayeli about a spring her family used to camp near, where the water tasted sweet, even in August. One afternoon, as she was patching an old saddle, she asked, "What will you do when your arm's better?" He was quiet a long time before saying, "Depends if you're still here." She didn't look up, but the way her hand slowed told him she'd heard every word. That night, he noticed she'd left the window unlatched, letting the scent of pine drift in. And when it was her turn to sleep, she didn't pull the shawl over her face like before. She lay on her side, facing the stove, her breathing slow and even. Jake sat in the chair by the door, rifle within reach, and realized that for the first time since the men had shown up, the quiet didn't feel like a trap waiting to spring. It felt like a choice they were both making one watchful night at a time, The morning broke hard and cold, the kind of Wyoming winter air that stung your lungs before you even stepped outside. Jake sat at the table, his coffee cooling in front of him, watching the faint line of light creep across the floorboards. He'd been turning the thought over for days, and now it was settled. "We're going to town," he said. Nayeli looked up from the strip of leather she'd been braiding. "For supplies, for papers." Jake replied, "A marriage license." Her hands stilled on the braid. She didn't speak right away, but her eyes searched his, as if weighing whether this was another form of chain or something else entirely. "It makes it harder for anyone to claim you," he added, "and harder for the law to side with them." A long moment passed before she nodded once, slow but certain. "All right." The lodge door groaned against the wind when they pushed it open. Outside, the world was pale and sharp. Snow crusted the ground in patches, and the bare branches of the cottonwoods rattled like bones. Jake saddled the horses while Nayeli bundled herself in the thickest coat they had between them. The trail wound through a narrow pass between jagged walls of granite, the sound of hooves echoing off stone. The cold bit at their cheeks, and every breath hung in the air like smoke. They crossed Powder Creek, where the water ran black under a skin of ice, the current tugging at the horses' legs. It was the kind of ride where conversation fell away not from distance, but from the simple need to keep your head down and push on. Jake glanced at her from time to time, noting the steady set of her jaw, the way she guided her horse with quiet confidence even when the path narrowed to a shelf above the river. By the time the cluster of buildings that passed for town came into view, the sky had shifted to a dim silver, clouds thickening over the peaks. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke from the stovepipes, a sharp contrast to the clean bite of mountain wind. The mayor's office was a squat wooden building with a single window facing the street. Inside, it was warmer than expected, the air heavy with the scent of ink and dust. A man in a worn vest sat behind a desk, looking up from his ledger as they stepped in. "Morning," he said, his gaze flicking between Jake and Nayeli. "What can I do for you, marriage license?" Jake said, his tone even. The man didn't blink, just reached for a pad of paper. Names. Jake gave his, then stepped back so Nayeli could speak her own. She said it clearly, each syllable deliberate, as if claiming the space her voice filled. The man wrote in slow, careful strokes, then tore the paper free. "Sign here, both of you." Jake scrawled his name in his usual blunt hand. Nayeli took the pen like it was something unfamiliar, pausing just long enough to steady herself before signing. When it came time for the rings, Jake patted his coat and came up empty. "No gold," he said quietly. Nayeli reached into her pocket and pulled out the thin braid of leather she'd been working on since morning. "This will do," she said. He slid the loop over her finger, the leather warm from her hand. In return, she tied a narrow strip of the same braid around his wrist. It wasn't polished, but it was binding in a way no gold could match. The mayor stamped the paper, folded it once, and handed it over. "You're set," he said simply. Back outside. The cold hit them like a wall. The street was quiet, only the crunch of their boots on packed snow breaking the stillness. Jake tucked the folded license into his coat pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. As they mounted up, Nayeli looked toward the mountains, her face calm but resolute. "Now it's harder," she said. "Harder," Jake agreed, "and harder's a start." They turned the horses toward the long road home, the sky pressing low overhead. The wind came at their backs now, and though the day was far from warm, there was something in the air between them, something steady, like the trail under their horses' hooves. The mountains waited, their slopes dark against the winter light, and beyond them, the old lodge stood alone, ready to be more than just a place to hide. By late March, the hard edge of winter had softened. The snow along the north slopes of the Bighorns gave way to trickles of meltwater, running fast and clear through the draws. On mornings when the wind came down gentle from the peaks, the air smelled of damp earth and pine sap instead of frost. The men from the tracks never returned. Whether they'd found trouble elsewhere or decided this fight wasn't worth it, Jake didn't care. The only sign of them was the memory still sharp, but no longer casting a shadow over every day. Nayeli claimed a small patch of ground just beyond the lodge, where the soil had thawed early. She worked it in the cool mornings, turning it over with the short-handled spade until it was fine enough to take seed. Beans went in first, then a neat row of greens she'd coaxed from a paper packet Jake had found in town. Her moccasined feet left light prints in the tilled rows, soon to be smudged away by the wind. Jake, for his part, had taken to building. He added a second stall to the horse shelter, planed new boards for the feed bins, and even started on a small grain shed. The sound of his hammer carried across the clearing, mingling with the creak of saddle leather and the quiet murmur of Nayeli's voice as she talked to the mule while feeding it. Inside, the lodge smelled different now. It still held the old scents: pine logs, smoke, a hint of leather, but they'd been joined by something warmer, the aroma of baking bread, herbs hanging from the rafters, coffee brewing in the mornings before the light reached the windows. Some days, Jake would find her mending a shirt by the fire, a pot simmering beside her. Other days, she'd be up on the roof with him, handing over nails while he fixed a loose shingle, her braid catching in the breeze. One morning, they sat at the rough-hewn table, each with a tin cup of coffee. Sunlight slid through the open door, catching on the steam. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. The quiet between them had changed. It wasn't the guarded stillness of strangers sharing a roof, but the ease of two people settled into the same rhythm. The work was constant, but it was the kind that left your bones tired in a good way. Evenings came with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. Sometimes they'd eat outside, plates balanced on their knees, watching the last light fade over the ridge. Other nights, they lingered by the stove, talking about the small things: how many beans had sprouted, whether the creek would rise with the next rain. Jake found himself noticing details he'd have missed before: the way Nayeli brushed dirt from her hands before coming inside, the small crease at the corner of her eyes when she laughed, the way she checked the latch on the shed without being asked. One afternoon, he paused in the doorway of the lodge, watching her in the garden. The breeze caught the hem of her dress, and the late sun threw a warm glow over her. She looked up and caught him watching. No words passed, but she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that stayed in the air even after she turned back to her work. They both knew the territory could turn on them without warning. Trouble might ride in tomorrow or a year from now. But for the moment, the ridge stood quiet, the tracks lay empty, and their days were their own. Jake thought of all the things he'd lost in the years before: the home, the family, the trust. Looking around now, he realized that what they had here was worth more than any claim in a gold field. It wasn't just shelter, it was something built between them, steady and lasting, like the mountains themselves. One evening, as they sat on the lodge steps, the last light spilling over the valley, Nayeli said softly, "This is more than I thought I'd have again." Jake glanced at her, then out at the darkening line of the ridge. "Me too." Neither of them moved for a long while. The air cooled, the stars came out one by one, and the quiet settled over them, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that fills a place to its edges, the kind you hold on to for as long as the land allows. The day had been full, the kind of work that left calluses warm and muscles aching. Jake had repaired the last stretch of fence along the south line, while Nayeli gathered the first shoots from her garden, a modest harvest, but a promise of more to come. By the time they finished, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the bighorns. They stood outside the lodge, the mountains catching the last light in bands of gold and copper. The air carried the faint scent of pine mixed with the cool edge that always came at dusk. Jake's gaze lingered on the far ridge before he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "You could have left after that day on the tracks. Would have been easy enough once you got your strength back." Nayeli looked at him, her dark hair stirring in the evening breeze. There was no hesitation in her answer. I stayed because I wanted to." Her words settled between them like the final piece in a puzzle that had taken months to fit together. All the tension, the silent watching, the tests of trust they'd led here to this plain truth. She hadn't stayed out of debt or fear, but because she chose to? Jake let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." The last of the sun dipped low, painting long shadows across the clearing. The lodge stood behind them, its walls weathered but strong, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. The land around was quiet, no riders on the horizon, no dust rising from the tracks. The dangers they'd faced felt like they belonged to another season, one that had passed without taking them down. The men from the tracks were gone for good, their threats swallowed by the distance and the indifference of the wild. The hunting lodge, once a place Jake had kept to himself, now bore the quiet marks of shared life, the extra water barrel, the neat rows of jars on the shelf, the garden patch already greening. They stood side by side as the light faded, the silence between them easy. Jake thought of the road that had brought him here, a trail worn by loss, long days alone, and the choice to stop chasing what he could never get back. He thought of the moment he'd first seen her on the rails, the cut of rope beneath his knife, and the sound of the train screaming past. Nayeli's gaze stayed on the horizon. She'd walked a harder road than most taken, traded, tied down in more ways than rope could bind. But here she was, standing unafraid in the open, the wind in her hair and the ground solid beneath her feet. The breeze shifted, carrying the soft rush of air through the pines. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its voice fading into the dark. Jake felt the weight of the day ease from his shoulders. "Feels like this place belongs to us now," he said. Nayeli's smile was small, but it reached her eyes. It always did. We just had to decide it. As the last band of light slipped behind the mountains, their shadows stretched long over the clearing. They stayed until the first stars appeared, neither moving to break the moment. In a world that could take everything without warning, sometimes a home wasn't a building or a plot of land. Sometimes it was simply where someone had chosen to stay with you, against the odds, through the quiet and the storms alike. Jake glanced at her once more, then turned toward the lodge. She followed, their steps falling in time, the door closing softly behind them as the night took hold. The wind moved through the pines again, but it no longer sounded like loneliness. In life, we are often faced with moments that test not only our courage, but our willingness to stand for what is right, even when it costs us something. Jake Murdoch's choice to step forward instead of looking away reminds us that doing the right thing is rarely the easiest path. It often means carrying the weight of responsibility, facing danger, and opening our hearts to the unknown. Nayeli's journey shows that trust is not built through words alone, but through steady, quiet acts of care. It teaches us that healing comes slowly, yet it grows stronger when shared with someone who chooses to stay, day after day. For many of us, especially in later years, the idea of starting over can seem daunting, but this story reminds us that it's never too late to find companionship, safety, and peace, even in the most unexpected places. The lesson is simple, yet powerful. Stand by those who have no one else, and cherish the rare moments of peace when they come. Because in a world where loss is inevitable, a steady hand and an open door can become the most valuable things we ever give or receive. Thank you for spending your time with us and for joining this journey into the heart of the Wild West. If this story touched you, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need its message, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life, and with your help, we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Every click, every share, and every comment means the world to us. Thank you for being part of our community.